Hey everyone, and welcome to day 7 in our study through the New Testament. Today we're going to be looking at John the Baptist being born. And we see here, it's coming from Luke 1, verses 57 through 66. And we're going to skip ahead a little bit to verse 59 here. We see that John is born, and on the 8th day, this is when the baby was 8 days old, they all came for the circumcision ceremony. They wanted to name him Zachariah after his father, but Elizabeth said no, his name is going to be John. So there's two things to look at here. One is they were commanded to have the circumcision 8 days after the baby boy was born. We see that in Genesis 17, verses 9 through 14, and we see that in Leviticus 12:3. The other common thing here, which is kind of common today in our world, is they wanted to name him Zachariah after his father. But, Elizabeth said, no, we're not going to do that. And so, they got upset. They're like, what? They exclaimed, there's no one in your family by that name. So it's common, like it is today, to name someone after we use middle names a lot of times. Sometimes we'll use first names, do juniors, the first, second, third. But it was common to use a name. And so they were upset that Elizabeth wasn't going to use the name John. And so we see in verse 62, so they used gestures to ask the baby's father, who was Zechariah, what he wanted to name him. And so one of the things I wanted to point out here is when we saw Zechariah was muted by the angel Gabriel at the beginning. And I said a lot of scholars believe not only was he mute, but he was probably deaf. And so this kind of further drills down on that point that more than likely Zechariah was both mute and deaf, couldn't speak or couldn't hear, and so that's why they had to gesture to him. Now, in the scheme of things, it doesn't really matter, but I like to drill down into little things like that when we find them. So Zechariah motioned for a writing tablet, and to everyone's surprise, he wrote, "His name is John." So Zechariah was obedient in naming the child, and confirmed his faith there, and then immediately I didn't put 64 in here, but immediately his voice and hearing were restored, and he was able to talk and hear again. And so we see in verse 65 and 66, awe fell upon the whole neighborhood, and the news of what happened spread throughout the Judean hills. Everyone who heard about it reflected on these events and asked, what will this child turn out to be? For the hand of the Lord was surely upon him in a special way. And so we see that everyone, in the community, everyone who was around them knew what happened. They knew that, they saw this whole thing. They saw what happened with Zechariah in the temple, and him coming out of the temple, and he was mute and deaf. And then Elizabeth, in her old age, becomes pregnant, right? I'm sure some things with Mary was still around, because Mary had come and visited. She was probably still here. We saw yesterday that she was still probably here when John was born. And so you had that happening. So I'm sure there was some talk with that, the virgin who's pregnant happening. And so they're reflecting. They see all this with John. He's born. And then instantly, as soon as Zacharias says, hey, we're going to name him John, he can speak and hear again. And so, I mean, everyone's going to be talking about this. I mean, we would if it was happening around here. And so, we see this, and everyone wants that surely something's going to special's coming out of this, and they were keeping an eye on it, and it did. And we know the rest of the story. They didn't at the time, but we see that now. I love this because I think we need to pay attention to this part where, they saw something special happening from the Lord, and they paid attention to it. Right? They said, what will this child become? They were like, something's going to happen here, and we need to do the same thing when we see things happening. We don't need to contribute it to luck or, well, those people were lucky. We need to contribute it to, when we see God's hand working in something, we need to contribute it to God and pay attention to it. And so, I don't know. I try to find little things to call out in these sections, but I think this is a big one. I think a lot of times us as Christians, and if you're not a Christian, then I hope you're paying attention to this too. But as Christians, sometimes we see things that God's clearly working in and opening doors or pushing us toward, and we just ignore it. And there was a lot of people in this time that ignored Jesus and ignored John and what he was doing. But there's a lot of people who paid attention, and I hope that we continue to be those people who pay attention to things when the Lord's working on them. So I hope that hits you today. It did hit me as I wrote or as I read this, and I hope you have enjoyed these. We've made it 7 days, and I don't know how many more we've got to go. We got a lot. It's going to be a slow process, but I think it's worth it because we really can dive down and get a little bit deeper into these subjects. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Have a good one.